Welcome back for another deep dive. This time we're going to be talking about something that I know you're really interested in, and that's tree pruning. You actually sent over a whole podcast episode on tree pruning. Looks like you're really ready to kind of take your tree care to the next level. So to help us both make sense of it all, we've got a certified arborist here with us today to guide us. It seems like there's a lot more to this than just grabbing some shears and going wild.
Absolutely. Pruning is a crucial practice for the overall health, safety, and longevity of our trees. And it's not just about aesthetics, although a well-pruned tree is definitely a sight to behold.
I've been thinking about it, and I have to admit I've been guilty of some pretty questionable pruning myself in the past. I kind of just figured, hey, it's a tree, how hard can it be? But clearly there's a lot more to it. So what's the big deal with pruning? Why is it so important for a tree's well-being?
Well, you see, trees have a natural system for shedding old or damaged branches. But in our managed landscapes, they often need a little bit of help. Removing these branches prevents the spread of disease and allows the tree to direct its energy towards new healthy growth.
I see. So it's kind of like we're stepping in and helping them out a little bit with something that they would naturally do themselves. It's interesting to think about how we impact those natural processes. Actually, the podcast episode that you sent over highlights some of the biggest pruning blunders that people make, and I'm sure I've made plenty of them myself. But one that really stood out was lion's tailing. I know for a fact I've been guilty of that one. Can you walk us through why that's so detrimental to a tree?
Lion's tailing is when you remove too many inner branches, leaving only a tuft of leaves at the tips. It might seem like you're opening up the tree and letting more light in, but you're actually making it weaker and more vulnerable to wind damage. You're really disrupting the natural balance and distribution of weight within the tree's structure.
So we need to kind of resist that urge to just go in there with the shears and really thin things out. What are some other common mistakes we should try to avoid?
Another big one is pruning at the wrong time of year. Most trees are best pruned during their dormant season, typically in late winter or early spring. Pruning during the active growing season can really stress the tree out and make it susceptible to pests and diseases.
So it's all about working with nature's rhythms and not trying to mess with its natural cycles too much. I have to say, I'm starting to feel a little bad for all those trees I've hacked away at in the past. But this brings up another question. Different types of trees need different approaches to pruning, right? I mean, a fruit tree probably needs different care than, say, a big oak tree.
That's a great observation. Different trees definitely have different growth habits and pruning needs. For instance, fruit trees often require specialized pruning techniques to maximize their yield.
So you're really trying to get the most out of those trees. You want those nice, juicy apples or pears or whatever it is you're growing.
Exactly. We prune them to encourage the growth of fruiting spurs and to maintain an open structure that allows sunlight to reach the developing fruit.
That makes a lot of sense. So what about those really big deciduous trees that we often see lining streets and parks? How are their pruning needs different?
Deciduous trees benefit from regular pruning to maintain their shape and structure. We remove dead or diseased branches. We thin out overcrowded areas and sometimes even shape them for clearance or aesthetic reasons. It's about working with the tree's natural growth patterns to ensure its health and beauty.
It sounds like there's a real strategy involved here. And speaking of strategy, let's talk about safety for a minute. You mentioned earlier that pruning is crucial for safety reasons. Can you give us some specific examples of what we should be looking out for when we're assessing a tree for potential hazards?
The most important thing is identifying any dead, diseased, or damaged branches. These can weaken the tree and become hazards, especially during storms. You also need to be mindful of branches that are growing too close to power lines, buildings, or other structures.
Right, you definitely wouldn't want a branch taking down a power line or crashing into your house during a storm. So it's about being proactive and identifying potential risks and then taking steps to mitigate those risks through strategic pruning. But it's not all about safety, is it? There's also the aesthetics, the way it looks. How do we strike that balance between keeping our trees safe and making them look good?
Well, pruning for aesthetics involves enhancing the tree's natural beauty and creating a balanced look. This might involve removing crossing branches, thinning out dense areas to let more light through, or shaping the crown to achieve a particular form. It's about working with the tree's natural form and enhancing its unique features.
It sounds like there's a real art to it.
There is.
So you have to really understand the tree's structure and kind of envision how it can be shaped to look its best. But as much as I'm learning here, I can't help but wonder if there's a point where it becomes too complex for the average person. When does it make sense to just call in a professional?
That's a great question. While basic pruning tasks can be handled by homeowners, There are definitely situations where it's best to leave it to the experts.
Okay, so what are those red flags? When would you say this is beyond DIY pruning? I need to call an arborist.
If you're dealing with large trees, trees near power lines, or trees that show signs of disease or damage, it's always a good idea to consult with a certified arborist. These situations often require specialized knowledge, skills, and equipment that most homeowners don't possess.
So it's kind of like you wouldn't try to do surgery on yourself. Sometimes you just need a specialist. What makes a certified arborist so special? What are we getting when we call in a prober?
Certified arborists have the knowledge, skills, and experience to properly assess your trees and determine the best course of action. They understand tree biology, pruning techniques, and safety protocols. They are also trained to identify and treat tree diseases and pests.
So it's about more than just someone who knows how to use a chainsaw. It's about entrusting the health and well-being of your trees to someone who really knows what they're doing.
Okay, this has been incredibly enlightening so far. I'm starting to really get a sense of how complex and nuanced proper tree pruning really is. And I, for one, am eager to dive into those specific techniques that you mentioned earlier. But before we do that, I want to make sure our listener has a chance to really absorb all this great information that we've talked about so far.
It sounds like you're ready to get your hands dirty and do some pruning.
I am. Before we started this deep dive, I really thought that pruning was as simple as just cutting off branches that look out of place. But I've definitely learned a lot since then. So where do we even begin? What are the fundamentals of good pruning technique?
Well, one of the most important things is knowing where to make your cuts. It's not about randomly removing branches. It's about precision and understanding the tree's anatomy.
Okay, so no more hacking away at random. Where should we be making those cuts? You want to make your cuts just outside the branch collar. That's the slightly swollen area where the branch attaches to the trunk, or a larger limb.
The branch collar. Okay, I think I can picture that. It's like a little shoulder where the branch meets the trunk.
Right.
Why is that specific spot so important?
The branch collar contains specialized cells that help the tree heal properly.
Uh-huh.
If you cut too close to the trunk, you risk damaging the collar and leaving a large wound. And that takes much longer to heal, and it can make the tree vulnerable to decay and disease.
So it's kind of like when you're bandaging a cut, you want to leave a little bit of extra skin around the edges to help protect the wound.
Exactly.
Makes sense. And what about the angle of the cut? Does that matter too?
It does. You want to make a slightly angled cut sloping away from the trunk or the main limb. This helps water run off the cut surface and prevents it from pooling and potentially causing decay.
Oh, that's interesting. So many little details to consider. You were talking about different types of pruning cuts earlier. Thinning cuts, reduction cuts, and heading cuts. Could you explain the difference between those? When would you use one type of cut over another?
Sure. Thinning cuts involve removing an entire branch back to its point of origin, either the trunk or a larger branch.
Okay.
This technique is great for opening up the canopy, improving air circulation, and reducing the overall weight on the tree.
So thinning cuts are all about creating more space and airflow.
Right. And it also helps to create a more balanced and aesthetically pleasing shape.
What about reduction cuts?
Reduction cuts are used to shorten a branch without removing it entirely. We make these cuts back to a lateral branch or bud. So we're reducing the length and weight of the branch, but we're still maintaining its natural shape.
I see. So it's less drastic than just cutting the whole branch off.
Right.
When would you typically use reduction cuts?
We use them when a branch is getting too long or heavy.
Makes sense. And finally, heading cuts.
Heading cuts are the most aggressive type of pruning cut. They involve removing the terminal bud of a branch, which forces it to sprout multiple new branches from below the cut.
So you're kind of forcing the tree to grow in a certain way.
In a way, yes.
When would you use heading cuts?
They're often used to stimulate new growth control the size of a plant or create a denser canopy. But it's important to use them sparingly because if you overdo it, it can make the tree look a bit unnatural.
Got it. Now, I have to ask about the tools themselves. I mean, a professional arborist must have quite a toolkit. What kind of tools do you use?
Well, of course, we use pruning shears for smaller branches. And then for thicker branches, we use loppers. For even larger limbs, we have pruning saws. And sometimes for really big jobs, we even use chainsaws.
So you have a tool for every occasion.
Pretty much.
Each tool is designed for a specific purpose and branch size, I imagine.
That's right.
And that helps to ensure that you're making clean, precise cuts without causing too much damage to the tree. We've talked about tools and techniques. What about safety? Especially when you're dealing with taller trees. What are some important safety precautions to keep in mind?
Safety is always the top priority. Always wear appropriate safety gear, like eye protection gloves and a hard hat. Never prune trees near power lines, and never work on a tree during wet or windy conditions.
Okay, so basically common sense precautions.
Pretty much. But it's easy to get caught up in the moment and forget about safety.
You've given us so much great practical information, but I'm curious, from all your years of experience, what are some of the biggest misconceptions people have about tree pruning? What are some things that you wish people knew?
Well, one of the biggest misconceptions is that pruning is just about aesthetics. People think it's just about making the tree look pretty, but
Yeah.
as we've talked about, it's so much more than that. It's
Right.
about the tree's health, its safety, and its longevity.
It's about taking care of the tree as a whole.
Exactly.
What other myths would you like to debunk?
Another common myth is that topping a tree is a good way to reduce its height.
Topping.
Cutting off the top of the trunk,
Oh, yeah, I've seen that.
that's a really bad idea.
Yeah.
It creates large open wounds that are slow to heal and become entry points for decay and disease. It also weakens the tree's structure and makes it more susceptible to wind damage.
So what's the right way to manage a tree's height if it's getting too tall?
The best approach is to use proper pruning techniques like those reduction cuts we talked about earlier. By selectively shortening branches, you can maintain the tree's natural shape while keeping it within a manageable height.
It's about working with the tree's natural growth patterns,
Right.
rather than just forcing it to do what you want.
Exactly.
It sounds like there's a real art to becoming a good tree steward.
There is.
And sometimes even the best care isn't enough.
That's true.
If a tree has simply outgrown its space, the best solution might be to remove it and plant something more suitable. It's about making choices that benefit both the tree and the surrounding environment. I have to say, this whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening for me. I'm feeling much more knowledgeable and confident about taking care of my own trees. But before we wrap things up, I want to hear your final thoughts. What's the one thing that you really want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
Well, the most important message I want to leave with everyone is that trees are living organisms.
Yes.
They deserve our respect and our care.
Absolutely.
And pruning is an essential part of that care.
It is.
But it's not something to be taken lightly.
Right.
It requires knowledge, skill, and a deep understanding of tree biology. So if you're ever unsure about how to prune your trees properly, please consult with a certified arborist.
Great advice.
They can provide expert guidance and make sure that your trees are getting the best possible care.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here today. I feel like we've explored so much. We talked about why pruning is important. We debunked some myths. And we even got pretty technical with different pruning techniques. I think our listeners are ready to go out there and start pruning like pros.
I hope so.
But before we wrap things up, I have this question. We've been focusing on, how we prune trees and why we do it. But have you ever thought about it from the tree's perspective? What do they think about being pruned?
That's an interesting way to look at it. Of course, trees can't really talk to us.
Right.
But if we think about it purely from a biological perspective, pruning is basically a form of stress for the tree.
Even when we do it right, it's still kind of like an injury.
Exactly. But the amazing thing is that trees have evolved over millions of years to deal with all kinds of stress and damage.
That's true.
So when we remove a branch, the tree responds by redirecting its energy and resources to other areas.
So it's constantly adapting.
Yes. It might stimulate new growth,
Yeah.
or strengthen existing branches, or even develop thicker bark around the wound to protect itself.
Wow, they really are incredible. They've been dealing with challenges for way longer than we have.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
Think about it. They've adapted to survive storms, animal browsing, even forest fires. Pruning is just another challenge they've figured out how to overcome.
When you put it that way, it really changes how I think about pruning.
Yeah.
It's not just about us controlling the tree, it's more like a collaboration.
Right.
We're working with nature's resilience. We're helping trees thrive in a world that's increasingly dominated by humans.
Exactly.
And who knows, maybe if trees could talk, they'd tell us to prune with care and understanding.
That's a nice thought.
It really is. I don't think I'll ever look at a prune tree the same way again. It represents the resilience of nature and our own ability to learn from nature. I want to thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of tree pruning. Hopefully you've learned a few things and you're feeling inspired to take a closer look at the trees in your own lives. Until next time, happy pruning.